Let's bring you some breaking news in the past couple of moments, and that is that the chairman of the inquiry into infected blood has announced he is recommending interim payments are made to the victims. Sir Brian Langstaff has been speaking in central London.
I have no power to order interim payments. My sole power is to make a recommendation. It doesn't have to be accepted by government, nor does it have to be accepted in full. I set out to answer two questions. First, whether I should exercise my powers to make a recommendation that interim payments should be made. And second, I should say, I recommended that they should. The second issue concerned the scope of those payments, and this is more complex. Sir Robert Francis QC recommended interim payments because the payment of full compensation could not be delivered quickly. He made a compelling case that interim payments are needed now to alleviate suffering and further suffering, and I agree with him. And I'm obliged to recognise that the practical way to make payments swiftly is to do so through the current infected blood support schemes. And that's why I've decided to recommend that interim payments of no less than £100,000 are made to all the infected people and all the bereaved partners who are currently registered with the schemes, and those who register between now and the inception of any future scheme. I know that that will be disappointing to some of you who may fall into neither category, and I apologise for that. I ask those who are disappointed to remember that this is not the end of the inquiry's work, and the question of compensation and its scope is not resolved in this short report on interim payments. I repeat, the interim report concerns only whether I should recommend interim payments.
Sir Brian Langstaff speaking in the last few minutes. Let's speak to our health correspondent, Jim Reid. Jim, this goes back to the 70s and 80s, affecting quite a significant number of people. Just to explain more background to this.
Affecting thousands and thousands of people. So two main groups of people were infected and affected by this. People with blood disorders, in particular haemophilia, which is a disorder that stops your blood clotting properly. Around 5,000, perhaps more than that, people were infected with HIV and hepatitis back in the late 70s, early 80s, after being given this new treatment called Factor VIII that was seen as revolutionary at the time. It was being imported mainly from the United States, where the people who were donating the blood plasma used to make the medicine often came from areas like prisons, which were seen as very high risk for blood viruses. As a result, if just one person of the 5,000 or 6,000 people that donated blood to make this treatment ended up being infected, it can infect whole batches of this drug. And as a result, many young children were infected with HIV. Around 2,500 haemophiliacs have died because of this already. And then the second group of people were people who received blood transfusions through that time. And that included, for example, Anita Ruzek. You remember the founder of Body Shop who died of a complication related to hepatitis C. And these were people, again, that might have had a blood transfusion in childbirth, in surgery, and ended up being infected with hepatitis as a result. And there's been an ongoing battle, really, by victims and also the families of those who've lost their lives for compensation in this case. So people have received payments in the past, but it's been annual support payments. Actual compensation by the state has never been agreed, which is why what you just heard there was very significant. It was the first recommendation, and it is just a recommendation from the public inquiry into this scandal, saying that an interim compensation should be paid of £100,000 each. We think to around 4,000 people, so that would come to a total bill to the government of roughly £400 million, if they agree with that recommendation.
And what are the indications that the government will agree to this?
Interesting. I mean, in the past, the government said it will consider these recommendations very carefully. When Matt Hancock, if you'll remember, was Health Secretary this time last year, so in June last year, he gave evidence to the same inquiry and said at that point that the government would, of course, as he put it, follow any recommendation that the inquiry made. Now today, Sir Brian Langstaff, that judge, has written to the Cabinet Office saying now is the time for these interim payments, partly because so many of the people involved in this are frankly so sick. There's a statistic that at the moment, one person who was infected is dying every 4 days through this inquiry because of what they were given, the NHS treatment they were given. And the idea is that some of these people very much need the financial support now, not at some point in the future.
OK, Jim Reed, thank you very much indeed.